Matrix, I hope you're ready to continue looking at ideas of natural selection and speciation. Last week we saw how speciation occurs when groups of organisms are separated from each other in terms of what we call allopatric speciation. Now, the environment may present some kind of external barrier to reproduction, such as the river, a mountain range, two populations basically separating the population into two. But that separation alone is not sufficient to make them into two separate species. Allopatry may start this process off, but there needs to be the development of genetically based or internal barriers to gene flow. Remember also last week we spoke about the two little frogs on either side of the road. We said that it's possible that the one species developing nearer a town had to develop a call that was more high-pitched, or maybe their mating call had to be produced later at night in order for it to be heard by the other frogs, because the atmosphere, the area around it, the environment was more noisy than the original population. We said that if that frog was reintroduced to population B once again, they would be making their call at a different time, and they'd be making it at a different pitch that the original population didn't actually understand and recognize as a mating call. And that's what we mean by something called internal barriers to gene flow, or reproductive isolating mechanisms. They isolate the two populations reproductively. So speciation requires that the two populations are unable to produce viable offspring together, or that they avoid mating with members of the other group. And so once two populations have been isolated from each other to the point that speciation has taken place, various mechanisms exist to keep the two populations reproductively isolated from each other. And we have two different kinds of reproductive isolating mechanisms. Pre-mating isolating mechanisms, which operate to prevent mating or to keep the species separate before mating can take place. And obviously, there's post-mating isolation mechanisms. Well, we're going to focus right now on pre-mating mechanisms, and after the break, we will look at post-mating isolation mechanisms. Well, the first pre-mating isolation mechanism is ecological isolation. The species live in different habitats, different environments. You can see ecology linked to habitats. That's how you're going to remember it. For example, they live on different islands, or one species lives in a desert and one species in a grassland. And so the two species won't wander into the other ecosystem because their food and shelter is in a different ecosystem. You are not going to get a grassland species automatically wandering into the desert when its food is linked to the grassland habitat. Another pre-mating isolation mechanism is temporal isolation. Temporal means time. So we see here that when we're looking at this kind of isolation mechanism, we're saying that the two species mate and reproduce at different times, maybe at different times of the year. One population mates during the winter months, early winter months, the other population at the end of winter into spring, and so there are different seasonal times working here for reproduction. And so even if the two species were put back together again, they're reproducing at different times of the year. It could also be different times of the day. A moth that mates at night is not going to be around when the moth that mates during the day is sending out its mating signals. Another pre-mating isolation mechanism is mechanical isolation. By mechanical, we mean positional or structural changes in the sex organs so that mating is no longer possible. In plants, for example, it could be that one population adapts to a new pollinator, and in this way, the two populations are mechanically isolated from each other. A behavioral isolation would occur when they produce different calls, produce different displays, all that make it totally impossible for the one population to communicate intention to mate with the other population because of their different languages that they're actually speaking. And so that's it for pre-mating isolation mechanisms. More about post-mating isolation mechanisms after the break.